Welcome to Vulture's Rainbow Theater, where once a week I'll be dropping a story of horror or fantasy straight from my own pen. Tonight's feature is the first chapter of a Western novella entitled The Guns of Sotol Flats. In the alternate universe of this story, you'll get a taste of pistols and sorcery and the haunted frontier of Navaja, a territory located somewhere between civilization and utter darkness. And now, The Guns of Sotol Flats, Chapter 1. The Guns of Sotol Flats by Michael Terlouw, Chapter 1. La Virgen Despoliada. The rain clouds, which dumped on Billy Ryder and Eduardo Gonzalez all afternoon, had finally moved on toward the west. Now their gray remnants were mixing with the low sun to create a bloody riot of color over there, spread across the desert sky. At its worst point, when it was a torrent, the rain had forced the two men to take shelter with their horses under a stand of alligator junipers, delaying their arrival at Sotol Flats. But that had been all right. Billy'd gotten a nap out of the deal, and now the desert floor was cooler than it had been in the morning. When their horses, loaded with gear, bore them over the next rise, their tired mounts sauntering between a couple of house-sized boulders, they came in view of the town. Beyond the rise and the boulders which crowned it, the desert floor ceased to roll and undulate, now seeming to spread out level all the way south to the distant line of the Sierra Negra Mountains. Ahead of them, about 100 yards away, stood a motley collection of mail-order wooden buildings and native adobe structures spread out across the rocky caliche like thrown dice. A cistern up high on stout wooden poles towered over the just discernible line of railroad tracks which passed along the edge of the community, coming in from the west and going on northeast toward Kildare 100 miles away. The flag of the Republic, rust red with its single pale blue star, flew in the breeze atop an incongruously placed ship's mast, located dead center in the town. The boys had arrived at Sotol Flats. By the time they'd goaded their tired horses onto the main street, sunset had compelled Sheriff Hallett and one of his deputies to walk on out from the courthouse toward the mast, which had been the gift of a former ship owner turned silver speculator. It was time to lower the flag, of course, and they would raise it again in the morning after breakfast. Hallett looked up when he saw the motion of the arriving men out of the corner of his right eye. In the hot part of the year, pretty much nothing moved in Sotol Flats during the day, even at sunset, so any kind of movement was worthy of note. "Well," he said, getting a load of the two unshaven men covered with dust, "I'll be damned if it ain't Billy Boy and Tiburon, come home for the summer. I heard y'all chased down old Tom the Kid Harkins out by Fort Dickerson. Was he alive when you brought him in?" "Yeah," said Billy. "I expect he's been hanged by now. They paid good bounty on him, too. Probably made us a couple of dollars on that one," he added. "Well, good on you, Billy boy," said the sheriff, smiling broadly under his mustache. The deputy, a young man with dark skin and a smooth Indian face, waved at Eduardo. "Hola, Tiburon," he said in the typical subdued tones of a Tolixqueño. "Como le ha ido?" Eduardo, known by his nickname El Tiburon, or the Shark, because of his noted skill at the gambling table, acknowledged the man with a gesture of the hand and a friendly flash of teeth. "Nos vemos en la mañana, amigo," he said. "Le digo todo." While Hallett chewed the fat with the two bounty hunters, the deputy went ahead with the business of lowering the flag. As he brought it down slowly, the desert breeze, picking up for the night, spread the banner out for one last full view. Under the pale blue star, for just a few seconds, the motto of the Republic was readable: "For liberty we fight." That legend, sewn in white letters against the rust-red field of the flag, was part of a longer phrase, a couplet written by the early Republic poet Daniel Greenleaf Ogden. "For liberty we fight. For freedom we die." Every schoolboy, including characters with possibly only a few years of schooling like Billy and Eduardo, knew that couplet by heart. The sheriff took a moment to help his deputy fold the flag before turning back to the two men who watched the proceedings silently, thinking about food and drink at the Cantina de Tres Rosas. In the growing dusk, they could see the lamps lit and flickering over there, could catch occasional snatches of music from a guitar within. A voice shouted good-naturedly for another drink. Hallett, handing the flag over to his partner, turned to the men with a more serious expression on his face. "I reckon y'all are headed over to the Rosas. You probably don't know what's been going on in there this last week." Eduardo, whose Uncle Isidro ran the joint, cut in anxiously. "Are we talking about some kind of trouble?" The sheriff took off his hat and scratched his head. "Maybe. What it is, see, is that they've been, well..." He stopped, apparently searching for the most delicate term he could find. "Some folks around here tell me the place has been visited." "Un fantasma. El ferrocarril de los muertos," murmured the deputy. Eduardo started to translate. "He says..." Billy cut him off. "I know what he said." "It's the strangest thing," said the sheriff. "They've been visited for 3 nights in a row." "Eduardo, you best talk to your uncle. He seems to think you got something to do with it." Without any further pleasantries, they turned their tired horses toward the cantina. Everything seemed normal over there as they closed the distance. Lamps flickered within, the picked notes of the guitar drifting in and out of their ears, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter or loud talk. They tied their mounts up at the rail outside the place, from which came the tongue-curling smells of chicken, beans, and warm tortillas de masa, a gratifying aroma which spelled the end of a long, hard road for them and easy times ahead, at least until the money got thin. They left their mounts packed for the moment, waiting till they'd signed in with Tio Isidro and could drag everything into a couple of upstairs rooms. Folks looked up when they came through the swinging doors, expecting to see somebody they knew from around town, as real strangers were few and far between. The customers weren't disappointed. Teresita, the young woman who helped serve men their drinks and beans, saw them and smiled, mostly at Eduardo. "Hey-yo, Billy," called Nicholas Hayworth, who ran things over at the train station. He was sidled up to the bar on a high stool, still dressed in his dark blue uniform, the brass-buttoned coat open, revealing a white boiled shirt over a cannonball belly. His hat, a little kepi with a brass star on the front, sat on the counter next to a half-finished shot of mezcal. A couple of Sotol Indians, dressed in work clothes stained with mud from the silver mines, looked up from their whispered conversation where they were sitting at one of the beaten tables down on the cantina floor. "Eduardo, how you been?" one of them said. "I can't believe you're still in business with that no-good son of a buck." El Tiburon laughed, and so did Billy. Tio Isidro wasn't around at the moment, so they hung their hats on the wooden tree by the door and found a couple of empty stools at the bar. Billy got a glimpse of himself in the cracked mirror which ran the length of the wall under the liquor cabinet across from him. Below the dark wooden shelves with their ranged bottles of cheap whiskey, fermented Sotol, and exported gin from the Old Kingdom, he could see his reflection. Sunburned cheeks, rough blonde beard with streaks of brown in it, blue eyes bleached the color of steel by more years than he could count under desert suns. greasy hair standing up on the crown of his head, but packed tight against the sides of his skull by the travel-stained felt hat he'd shoved down over his noggin every day for years. Not a pretty sight, he said to himself. It'd be worth a couple of dollars to get a bath, not to mention a proper shave and haircut. He wouldn't want Sequoia to see him like this. He always made sure she never did. Behind him in the mirror, he caught sight of the Tolixqueño with the guitar. The little man was perched in a corner on a stool of his own, picking at the beat-up old instrument, playing snatches of melody that meant something to the campesinos and Tolixqueño miners who sat drinking or scooping up beans with their rolled tortillas. For the white men there, except for Billy, who'd been raised in a Tolixcan family after his parents were killed, the music was just exotic noise, something pleasant from across the border and the river. Billy, however, knew the songs and even the words to them. He sang a snatch of verse in Tolixqueño with the flamenco trills coming from over his back. The guitarist wasn't looking at his fingers. They knew what to do. The guitarist was exchanging looks with Billy in the mirror. In fact, the musician was giving him and Eduardo a fixed stare. Billy was starting to get a hinky feeling about it when Tío Isidro walked in from the back room, a large mustachioed man with an apron tied over a worn shirt, drying his hands with a threadbare towel. "Mano de los siete!" he exclaimed when he saw who'd come into his establishment. "Eduardo, my nephew, and Mr. William Ryder, Esquire. Welcome home." He was all smiles, genuinely glad to see them, but Billy had caught the worried, tired look in the eyes just before he'd caught sight of them. Something was wrong. A strong night breeze blew up suddenly along the street outside, raising dust, causing the swinging doors to rock back and forth, as though someone had just passed through them. "You boys are a sight for painful eyes," he said to them. The grin on his face sure looked painful, probably because it didn't match his eyes at all. "That's a sight for sore eyes," corrected Eduardo. "You too, Tío Isidro. We've been gone a long time." Isidro turned toward the back room where the kitchen was, shouting at a woman back there. She came out, bringing with her the good smells of the cooking, wiping her hands with a rag, a heavy old woman with her white hair in braids, her sunburnt Indian face quizzical at first and then suddenly radiant as she saw her favorite nephew. "Ay, mi Eduardo," she cried. "Deme un besito." El Tiburón leaned over the counter and gave her the kiss she asked for, planting it squarely on her broad Indian cheek. Patting him on the head as if he were still 5 years old, she favored him with another sweet smile, then came over to get her tribute of a kiss from Billy. "Tia Marta," he said with a kind of good-natured reverence, pecking her on the cheek, "I swear you look prettier even than when we left." She faked suspicion, striking him gently on the shoulder. "And you are a bigger liar even than when you left," she said. Billy laughed as Tío Isidro scolded her back into the kitchen, with instructions to return with food for the two weary bounty hunters. Eduardo lost no time in getting down to business with his uncle. "Tío," he said, reaching over the bar to grab Uncle Isidro's arm gently. "Tell me what is going on. Already I'm in town for 10 minutes and I hear crazy things from the sheriff. I'm from the deputy." Isidro lowered his head, his shoulders sagging as he laid his towel on the bar. He leaned forward then, resting his elbows on the counter, inviting them by this gesture to lean in closer so he could whisper. "We close at 11:30, he said. "You will find out then. Right now, sign the register." Moving away, he said out loud, "I will have Teresita open up 2 rooms for you and bring you the keys. You need help with those packs?" They shook their heads. While he was giving them instructions, his hands worked automatically, setting a bottle of mezcal on the bar with 2 green goggle glasses. He poured and slid them over to the 2 men. "Beers to chase that down with?" Billy asked. Tio Isidro, his face now like stone, the false smile now gone, turned to grab a couple of mugs. Looking out at nothing, he filled them from the tap and set them down, then moved off without another word to check on his other customers. The two men left their drinks on the counter, headed back outside into a clear night full of stars to untie their packs and bring them back in. Billy signed for both of them just in time to have Teresita hand over the keys, one for him, one for Eduardo. After they stowed their packs into upstairs room, they came back down to relish those drinks. It was only about 9 o'clock, Billy guessed, which meant that they had an hour before the stables closed. The horses would need to be fed, rubbed down, and put away for the night. It would have been preferable to fall into bed after that, but something was up, and he knew that Eduardo would want to get to the bottom of it that evening. Billy himself was curious. Hell, he could sleep late anyway. Tia Marta brought the food, which they wolfed down, tossing the beer down with it, afterwards sipping gently on the mezcal. In the fine glow of their dinner and drinks, they got the horses stabled and returned to the cantina. Eduardo reached for the pack of cards he carried in his shirt pocket, and the two of them sat down at a table. Billy listened to the town talk for entertainment, while Eduardo laid out his cards in rows, treating himself to a game of solitaire. His pack was old and beaten, the suits barely readable on some of the cards, the numbers barely legible on others. Working on a row, he laid out a 6 of pistolas, followed by a 4 de esmeraldas. Another emerald followed, then an 8 of coins and a 3 of swords. He looked up an hour and a half later when he heard chairs sliding under tables. People were leaving. In fact, they were leaving in a way he had never seen, all at once. They didn't seem to be panicked exactly, but anxiety was in the air. Glances were exchanged as men, walking a little less slowly than they might have, sauntered toward the swinging doors. The guitar player set his instrument down with infinite care in its wooden stand. He rose, reached into a cup at his feet, pulling out the coins and the dollars that had been left there, counting them, and then moving toward the door in a straight line. He did not say good night to Tio Isidro or to the two bounty hunters. Tio Isidro, not looking up from his work, wiped the bar down, grabbing half-empty mugs and goggle glasses, putting them gently into a ceramic basin full of water to soak. He replaced a bottle of whiskey in the shelves, gazing for a moment at the door as if he were listening for a sound he expected to hear. Tia Marta came out of the kitchen with a couple of stacked pots of leftover food. Kissing Uncle Isidro on the cheek, she went out through the swinging doors in the company of the young woman Teresita, headed for home. The place was dead quiet now, except for the chirping of a single cricket just under one of the open windows to the place. Isidro had not yet pulled the shutters closed for the night. Suddenly, Eduardo stiffened. "Escuche," he whispered. "Listen." At first, Billy couldn't hear anything except maybe the wind blowing into the town as the desert floor cooled. Then came the distant sound of a train, rumbling on its tracks, still a ways out in the dark, but audible enough. The sound grew a little louder as the train closed distance with the town. It was then that Billy realized something. There was no train that came into Sotol Flats at this hour. Eduardo supplied an answer to that riddle. "El ferrocarril de los muertos," he muttered. "It is the train of the dead." Sure enough, the ghostly sound of the train indicated that it was slowing, that its phantasmal brakes had engaged, that it was coming to a stop in Sotol Flats. Isidro stood stone still like a statue of a barkeep, still clutching the towel, not wiping down anything. Billy found himself reaching for his holster, undoing the leather strap which kept his 6-shooter secure. He let his fingers pass over its wooden steel handle, finding reassurance there, even though he knew for a fact that his pistol would do him no good in this situation. You can't fell dead men with bullets, at least not with the kind he'd put in the chambers of his revolver. Eduardo, on the other hand, had pulled out his own iron, laying it on the table and reaching into a leather pouch he wore around his neck. He set 3 bullets out from the pouch, etched with some kind of strange symbols on them, stained with what looked like dried blood. These he placed into 3 chambers of his guns, after having emptied out their ineffectual counterparts. "You got any more of those on you?" asked Billy. "Yes, amigo," Eduardo said, "but they are not for you. You know this." Billy did. Not for any money would he do what Eduardo had done to earn the right to shoot bullets like those. He was thinking about that when Isidro said, "My nephew, I can hear the footsteps of the pasajero. Only 1 passenger gets off that train for the last 3 nights, and each time he shows me a bullet like the ones in your gun. I do not speak the language of los muertos, but I know from the bullet that he has been asking for you." To this Eduardo nodded calmly. "Sí, mi tío," he said. "You let me handle this." Billy and El Tiburon could hear the footsteps themselves now. They were slow, jingling and deliberate, coming audibly closer but without any sign that the owner of the feet had arrived at the cantina. Just as the tension became intolerable, the doors swung open, blown by a strong night breeze. The temperature suddenly dropped until the room felt like winter. When the wind died, they saw him, the newly arrived pasajero from the dead train. He was a tall man, dressed in the resplendent costume of a wealthy charro, sewn of light gray chamois, decorated with silver. Down the outer seams of his tightly fitted pants ran large silver buttons in gleaming rows. He wore a matching jacket, a saco corto, with silver buttons like the ones on his pants. His boots, black and gleaming, bore resplendent silver spurs. The buckle of his belt was silver. His tie, a jet-black corbatin, hung in 2 black bows against a frilly white shirt, like the wings of a crow. From the right side of his shiny black belt hung a black holster bearing a silver and black revolver. On his head he wore a magnificent sombrero, made of woven palm covered in black felt, embroidered with repeating designs in silver thread. The wide brim of the hat framed the man's head, which was the bare, white skull of a dead man, the sockets eyeless and dark. The only sign of life on the face was a great black mustache, carefully cut and waxed into twin curls at its ends. With bony hands, the passenger from the ghostly train hung his hat on the brass knob of the wooden tree by the door, the impossibly wide brim of the sombrero covering Billy's and Eduardo's travel-stained headgear. He walked to a table hugging the wall under one of the cantina's windows, seating himself in one of the cane-bottomed chairs with the deliberate slowness and dignity of an older man. Isidro, who had come unfrozen and who had apparently been busy during the mysterious guest's appearance, now approached the chair respectfully, carrying a small glass of Sotol and a puro. Setting the drink down in front of the deceased gentleman, Isidro offered him the cigar, which he took in bony fingers, sticking it between 2 rows of bare, glossy teeth. The dead man turned toward the barkeep, pointing the cigar at him expectantly. Tio Isidro obliged with a lit match, and the mustachioed charro sat back in the chair, inhaling and then releasing a puff of rich smoke into the still and frozen air of the cantina. He then laid it down at the lip of the table, the ash end hanging just over the edge, and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a single, blood-stained bullet etched with signs, just like those Eduardo had put into his revolver earlier. This object he set onto the table, standing it on its flat end. Then, with a long, thin finger, he beckoned Billy's friend to come sit. El Tiburon did as he was told. The dead, no longer in possession of lips and tongue, had long ago found other means of speech, using the assets which still remained to them. The man ground his molars together in various ways, producing an astonishingly wide array of noises, which sounded more or less like the groaning protests of planks in a wooden sailing ship on heavy seas. El Tiburon replied in kind, producing grinding sounds of his own, to which the dignified old charro listened intently, occasionally taking a puff from his puro. The Sotol he did not drink, preferring instead to hold it in front of the hole where his nose had once been, allowing the delicate fumes of it to drift up into the empty hold of his skull. At last silence fell, and Eduardo, after waiting respectfully for further words, turned to Billy and Isidro. "This gentleman tells me that he lived here in Sotol Flats long ago, when it was a pueblo called Angeles de Merced. He was a rural, a ranger who rode the borderland and the desert, watching for thieves and for hostile Indians. He says that in life he was called Don Jose Rodrigo González de Santos Selim." "Did he tell you why he's here?" asked Billy, his hand close to the useless revolver which hung over his right pocket. "Si, Billy," Eduardo replied. "I will tell you what he said, but now he asked you to come sit in this chair. For you, he also has a message." Ryder was not happy to be taking Eduardo's place at the table. His guts were now like water, and it didn't help his flagging courage when El Tiburon gestured with his eyes to take the hand away from the gun. As useless as it was, it gave him a sense that he could do something if the situation went south. Now, his hands hanging numbly, he sidled up to the table, sitting down in front of the resplendent apparition, who regarded him with empty, black eye sockets. Slowly, the dead man reached back into the breast pocket of his saco, producing a deck of cards like those Eduardo carried, only these looked much more expensive, much more durable, and at the same time, much older. As Don Jose spread his deck out on the table, Billy could see the flecks and lines of real gold leaf paint and even tiny bits of emerald and ruby glued into the corners of some of the cards. He did not lay out, as Eduardo had done at solitaire, the usual cards with their suits of pistols, emeralds, swords, and coins. No, he was laying out the cards of the major arcana, beautifully rendered with portraits of some of the 7 saints, with sacred symbols bordered in impossibly detailed leaves and vines, or with images from out of sacred Tolixcan legend. At last, after laying out a pattern of cards in a cross and 3 cards in a vertical line, he laid out the last one, pointing at it to Billy. The single card bore the disquieting image of a young and beautiful woman sitting on the floor in a house, her legs spread apart and her skirt hiked up around her hips, the shadow of the skirt just covering the private area of her body. On the wooden floor between her legs could be seen a small puddle of blood. The woman's head leaned loosely back against the wall, the eyes staring sightlessly in death, the mouth open, out of a corner of which a drop of saliva slid down toward the chin. Above and to the right of the woman's head, a window revealed a deep blue night sky in which a crescent moon could be seen. shining through onto the dead woman's face. Behind him, Billy could hear the voice of El Tiburón naming the card. La Virgen Despoliada. It is the despoiled Virgin. Billy wished he also had a glass of Sotol. I hope you enjoyed this first chapter of The Guns of Sotol Flats. Look for further installments of this novella and other short stories dropped approximately once a week. You may also preview and, if you like, buy my 2 novels, The Yule Country and Beggar's Night, on Amazon.com. Our regular host, Mr. Damon Vulture, will see you next week on this Vulture's Rainbow channel.